Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fila Townsend, and I'm a policy entrepreneur at Next 100. And I cannot tell you how excited I am to have this panel of speakers, to have this conversation. I think it's long overdue, but at the same time, I think it's right on time given the moment that we're in. But before we jump in, just want to do a few shout outs. So first, I want to thank my Next 100 family, the Century Foundation family. You guys have been super supportive in helping to pull this all together. I want to definitely give a shout out to my co-sponsor, the National Black Worker Center, Tanya Wallace. I'm really thrilled to have you here and excited for you to be telling everyone about Black Labor Day, your Be Ready campaign, all that good stuff. And Aisha, anyone who knows me, by the way, knows I love Co-worker. I love the work that you guys do. And then Nikki, of course, I've known you for some years now. I think Tanya, we all met through Kaiser. And so just really thrilled to have you all. So I just want to give a little background. I know we have hopefully some new folks who aren't familiar with Next 100. So Next 100, we are a new generation of policy leaders. We focus on a range of issue areas from criminal justice reform to immigration to education and issues falling at the intersection. We believe in the power of policy and people, and in fact that the real magic happens when those forces are brought together. We believe that who is doing the work matters, not just for identifying the problems and issues, but especially for developing the solutions. And I think that really comes through with the panel that we have here. So I work in the area of economic opportunity. Generally, I look at labor policies. And I just want to talk a bit about what I bring to this. I have more than 15 years of work in the space of labor and employment in a variety of sectors and industries from a variety of perspectives. And I think what I've learned, especially doing this work in the past year with Next 100, as we think about policies, is we need to be more worker-centric. What that means is we need to be thinking of people, not just as whole people, which sounds a bit odd to say, but it's true. We tend to, in our policies, think of people as consumers rather than workers, or we focus on the effect of policies on prices and markets and not on wages. And then there's, of course, the issue of, racial, social, and economic inequity and injustices, right? And so to me, this is actually largely what I think, and I would say has been missing from policies in the last probably half decade, if not even before that, depending on what we're talking about. And so, again, I cannot wait to jump into a lot of this. I want to just set the stage a bit with a few numbers and just to really hit home where we are. So some of you may know this, but if you make the federal minimum wage of $7.25, you are not able to afford one, let alone 2-bedroom apartment. So 2 bedrooms, you would have to work 97 hours in a week. A 1-bedroom, 79. So let's do the math, right? It doesn't add up. More than 40% of workers lack appropriate protections, benefits, access to healthcare, access to sick and paid leave, childcare. This was before the pandemic, by the way. These were independent workers who are not considered employees under the law. More than 40% of people have no emergency funds. Through the pandemic, though, we've seen 40 million people who've been laid off. We'll maybe get to this later, but I think this is important because as we look to other countries in the world, we don't see the same patterns in laying off that we see here in America. As of June data, the Black unemployment rate was 16.7% compared to the white unemployment rate of 14.2%. And this is important, even outside of a pandemic, the Black unemployment rate persistently is above white unemployment. And so what we see is this combination of being overworked, underpaid, unprotected, really has culminated into what I call through this pandemic, a game of Russian roulette, right? There are many workers who had to make the choice, do I go to work today so I can pay my bills, or do I go to work or do I stay home so I can pay my bills, or do I go to work and get a death wish, right? 200,000 people have died here in the US and the number's still rising. That's about 20% of worldwide cases. We're only 40% of the world's population, right? And as has been reported over and over, many of these deaths are workers, and disproportionately Black, Latino, and other non-white racial and ethnic groups. So I point this out, even though you may already be aware of this, because I want to hit home a really crucial point. If you are a worker and you are in America, you are more likely to fall victim to and die of the pandemic, right? And then there's another pandemic. We don't think of it as that, but it certainly is, right? It certainly kills, and that's the pandemic of racism, right? It's as if we're in this continuous hell of pushing a boulder up a mountain only to see it return to the bottom of the hill every night, right? The futility and absurdity and the intentionality, frankly, of police-involved killings, the continued denial that systemic racism exists when you, frankly, at this point have to be blind to not see its impact across issue area after issue area. And while some of us feel the disproportionate impacts of this every day, it is systemic. Right? It hides in plain sight. It's in the air we breathe, shaping our unconscious biases. It's in the images we see replayed over and over on TV and on social media. It's rooted in the soil that this country is built on. It's in our language. It's in our books. It's in our business models. It's in our laws, and it's in our policies. So let's be clear, no matter your race, socioeconomic level, or education, it impacts us all, just maybe differently. So why this conversation today? So I think this panel is really a powerful example of policy in action, especially as we think about policies as they relate to workers. One, it's elevating the voices of folks on the ground doing the work. Research is really important in policy, but all too often we are having conversations in spaces about workers and not with workers. All too often, we are talking about policies and conversations that impact Black workers and other workers of color, and these are not people in the conversations talking and driving the solutions. And so our panelists today, I think it's not lost on you, are all Black women working at very high levels in labor. And I would just add, and this was really intentional, they are from all different types of labor organizations. As part of my work, I've really been trying to advance this idea that today's labor organizations are not just made up of unions. Unions are critically important. I think we're seeing that come more to light today. But there are certain reasons why these organizations have had to exist, and many of which is because our labor law, has not allowed certain workers to organize. And so these organizations that are not unions that are represented today fill a really critically important gap in our society. And so I thought it was really important to highlight in that work. So the color of labor, right, as the panel's name reflects, has different meanings. It doesn't just speak to the legacy and the rudeness of Black workers and labor in the history of this country, progressive movements, the fight for civil rights, voting, and all sorts of human rights. It also says something about the diversity of workers, right, of our workforce, their identities, their occupations, and their values, and the labor organizations that support, represent, and advocate for them. Workers have always been more than blue-collar, white working class, and labor has always been more than unions. And our policies must reflect the extent of this diversity. So what do I want to accomplish today? I'm going to bring in our speakers. I want to obviously have a conversation, maybe even debate some about what we think we should be focusing on in our discourse and conversations and policies focused on workers. What is it that we need to do to bring about systemic change? What does systemic change even look like? What are the interventions and solutions necessary to ensure that we are really on a path to addressing structural inequality and systemic racism, and that this is not just a current moment that we're in or talk and performativism? So with that, I will turn things over to Tanya Wallace Goburn. Tanya, I'm so excited to have you. I'd love for you to share and talk about what the last 6 to 7 months have been like for you, for your organization, and the work that you all have been doing.
Sure. Thank you, Fila. I'm really happy to be part of of this very important conversation, especially to be partnering with Next 100 and in the company of Aisha and Nikki, two phenomenal leaders of our labor movement. And I agree with you, our labor movement is not just a union movement, but a worker movement across this country. I think I want to start off by talking about what and who the National Black Worker Center is. At our inception, the National Black Worker Center has been a network of worker centers across the country, 8 worker centers across the country, whose mission is based on fighting racism and discrimination in the workplace and educating about the impacts of racism and discrimination on Black workers in particular. You mentioned earlier about our event, Black Labor Day. About 4 years ago, we started to have these Black Labor Day events. And people may say, why Black Labor Day? We also do it on the day that other people call Labor Day. And the reason that we decided to host these events is because of one simple thing. If you think about Labor Day, you think about workers and you think about labor, but frequently we don't think about or hear the stories about Black workers. And when we think traditionally about Black workers, what comes to mind? Frequently, what comes to mind are negative images, our stereotypes. Definitely, we don't think about innovation. We don't think of, Black workers as being the builders of cities, of our landscape that we see all around us. But the reality is, there's no city, there's no state, either urban or rural, that you can go to and look at that you won't see the labor of Black workers. And we look at that next to this landscape of a negative narrative about Black workers, which is that Black workers are lazy, that Black workers are, predominantly working in low wage jobs, that Black workers are unemployed. And so we started Black Labor Day as a way to lift up Black workers, to tell our story, to highlight that Black workers have. So I'll go back to talking about who we are as an organization. Recently, we have made a concerted effort to expand our base and to provide training to help workers navigate the pitfalls of working while Black and to build better work environments. And the ways that we've been thinking about who our base is by doing just a quick assessment. I call it the ones, the twos, and the threes. And if you come from the union movement, you're very familiar with doing assessments and ratings. And so very quickly, the ones are who we would call early adapters. They're the individuals who, would consider themselves progressive. They vote regularly. The threes are people who don't agree with us, quite frankly, and there's nothing that we could say to change their minds. The twos are our sweet spot. Those are those individuals who don't consider themselves progressive, not at all. They may work several jobs. They don't have have not had the ability extended to them to really get involved in political discussions, specifically discussions about what's going on in their environment and their livelihood. And so we think that that's the sweet spot. That's where we need to give our attention to. We don't need to spend time talking to people that don't agree with us, and we certainly have spent enough time preaching to the choir. It's time for us to expand our base and talk to those individuals who have not been part of discussions around what it means to build movements and what it means to end systemic racism. And so at the National Black Worker Center, our strategy is based on building a leaderful movement. It's on our understanding that Black people have long been ready to be the leaders of their own liberation. Our focus on leadership development capitalizes on the truth that researchers and social strategists are only now beginning to recognize. In a recent study of Black and Latinx women and girls, Black leadership found that Black girls are more likely to identify as leaders than girls of any other race. Furthermore, girls of color were more likely to report that they seek out leadership opportunities in comparison to white girls. Studies of Black workers have also seen similar results. The Building Movement Project surveyed nonprofit leaders and found that Black people were often overqualified for leadership positions, but were routinely undermined and discouraged by their colleagues. And so the work of the National Black Worker Center is to provide fertile ground for Black workers to express the leadership skills and the ambition that we already have.
Thank you so much, Tanya. There's a lot to chew on, and I definitely want to get into that when we jump into our group piece of this. So I want to pull in to Nikki. Love to have you talk about what has been going on at SEIU. And then Nikki, as you might have seen in the bios, the director of the Public Services Division at SEIU. So what have the last 6 to 7 months been like for your organization, Nikki?
Well, first, I want to say thank you, Fila, and just appreciate you for allowing me to participate alongside these other two very amazing women. So sure, I can talk to you about, you know, the last 6 to 7 months at SEIU. Just for folks who don't know, SEIU represents about 2 million workers across the US, Canada, and Puerto Rico, and we're divided up into multiple divisions, the healthcare division, the property services division, and the public services division where I work. And in the public services division, we represent you know, a bunch of state and county, local government workers, but where my heart and my passion and where I've spent a lot of my time and energy is with our members who work in education. The folks who do childcare and preschool, K through 12 education, higher education, and we represent almost 300,000 workers in that sector. And I've spent a lot of in the last several years, you know, working to, you know, make sure that they have access to the union. And so we get to the pandemic, and you know, this is a workforce, especially in education. Our members are the folks that are generally invisible, right? Because when you think of, you know, the workforce that I just talked about, you know, generally when people talk about K through 12 or they talk about higher education, they think about the teachers and they think about the professors and the folks who are standing in front of the classrooms. And, you know, those are obviously super important jobs, and you know, and the services that they provide are super important. But you know, the cafeteria workers who make sure our kids are fed and get healthy food, our bus drivers who make sure that our kids get back and forth to school, the school aides who help our kids get on the internet when they're sitting in the library and are at school. You know, these are the folks that when we talk about school workers, you know, generally folks are not thinking about them, and they have been very invisible. But the pandemic has really shone a light on them, because now that, you know, we you know, are basically, I mean, in most places across the country, you know, distance learning has become, you know, the norm. You know, parents like myself, I have a 6-year-old, you know, who are trying to, you know, balance work with, you know, homeschooling, are now starting to see that, you know, it's not just the teachers that are, you know, so critical to, you know, just the lives of our children. And when you think about, you know, the impact that the pandemic has had on them, right? So one, the pandemic has, I think, brought them out of the shadows, and people, you know, now really understand, you know, what they mean to our children. But also when you think about, the essential workers who are providing healthcare, who are, making sure that, all of the critical services that we need to continue to have. Many of them have children, and many of them are not able to, take care of their kids. They don't have the luxury like many of us who are on this webinar today who can work from home. They have to go to work. And so it's our members who are the ones who are, taking care of their kids and making sure that they get what they need. Even in these large school districts, in large urban areas where the schools have been closed, our members have been distributing lunches, 3 times a day to make sure that, because we also know that, those school meals for many children is the only food that they get. And so in the midst of the pandemic with schools closed, our members have still been making sure that, kids are getting fed. So, I would say, because I could go on and on and on about this particular issue, what I would say is that the pandemic has shown others what we already knew, right? Which is that, public investment is critical to, to our survival. And that when you think about the group of workers that I'm talking about and the families that are impacted, these are mostly Black and Brown women who, what is really shameful is when you think about, the level of pay, their access to quality healthcare and their access to quality education. These are things that when you think about it, you sort of assume, oh, union members, so they must be doing okay. And what folks should know is that that's not necessarily the case, that many of our members, we are the Service Employees International Union, meaning our members are the ones who provide services. And generally speaking, they are at the lower end of the income scale and are, barely making ends meet. And so, hopefully we'll get to this later, in the conversation. But when we talk about the pandemic, many folks are, having conversations in the public space about getting back to normal. And for our members, we don't want to go back to normal because normal wasn't good for us. And so I think that's been the main focus at SEIU is, how do we use our power of collective action to rise up so that what we return to is not normal, but something that is, what our families deserve. So yes, I'll stop there. I have much more to say.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. I mean, a lot of what you said there was powerful. I mean, this idea of not going back to normal, or the idea that things were never really normal, right? I think really resonates. Right. So Aisha, I want to bring you in. Please tell us about the work you've been doing. And I would love to also hear, as you talk about what Coworker has been doing, how you are different from a union and what your work is really about.
Thank you. I'll start by saying I'm really excited to share space with these incredibly powerful, brilliant Black women, especially in a movement that doesn't always make space for us. And especially when conversations about work do not include the reality that work is not safe. It's not usually a safe space for us. So I just wanted to preface my remarks with that. I'm going to start by telling y'all a little bit about myself, because I think that will give context around why Coworker exists and how I came to be a part of this team. And then I'll give an overview of what we do and what we've seen change and not change in our work over the last 6 to 7 months. So for the last 25 years, I've worked at the intersection of workers' rights, advocacy, and technology. I've been rank and file at AFSCME and OPEIU. My husband's worked inside organized labor for 25 years. I've worked inside 2 of the largest labor unions in the country, SEIU and NEA, and I cut my teeth as an organizer, both in the US and in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly working around healthcare issues and pro-democracy movements. On the tech side, which a lot of people won't think makes sense in an organizing context unless you're trying to sell digital organizing, which I did and don't do anymore. But I've built and run digital advocacy campaigns and teams for unions, for nonprofits, for advocacy organizations, foundations, political campaigns, and even a global digital agency. So I've approached using technology as a tool to win and often force change from a lot of different angles. And in my current role at Coworker, I'm building and leading a team and an organizational culture that's rooted in equity, transparency, and liberatory practice, which is really important to Black people and into ending systemic injustice. So Coworker.org is a digital-first organization that supports worker organizing with folks who are often outside of the traditional union organizing context. And the organization was founded 8 years ago by 2 women with deep roots in organized labor. So the 3 of us all came from SEIU. That's where we cut our teeth and spend a lot of time. We do our work in a couple of ways. We have a petition platform that working people can use to start their own campaigns to try to make a change in the places they work, usually an important policy change. And we also do relational organizing. We offer coaching and leadership development and support opportunities for working people who need our help and are taking risks by standing up and fighting for and leading the change they want to see in their workplaces. And because we're digital first, that means we're able to do that across industry, across job type, across geography. And we can see a real cross section of where people need help, what the trends are in some regions and some areas of work. So we are able to use both digital and social tools to engage in all kinds of organizing efforts for people who don't have unions in their workplace, who will probably not have a union in their workplace because of what they're up against, but they still want to put themselves on the line with their coworkers to try to win campaigns and change working conditions. So in the last 6 to 7 months in particular, we've helped a lot of people amplify and win workplace campaigns around hazard pay, paid leave, fair wages, dress code policies. We had one petition that got, the last time I checked, it might be higher, but it got more than 80,000 signatures. It was a postal worker-led petition where they were demanding better protections from COVID. And multiple senators cited that petition in letters to the Postmaster General. Our workload essentially increased by about 400%. I mean, we're a small organization, and we were used to having people start, 2 or 3 campaigns a week. Within the first month of the shutdown, we had hundreds of campaigns where people were asking for help, asking for hazard pay that doesn't expire, trying to help people who are newly categorized as essential workers and didn't sign up to have their lives on the line so we could buy groceries or they could deliver packages or those kinds of things. People asking for access to PPE, people who really need help around dubious paid time off policies where companies are promising that you can take time off if you're sick or someone in your family's sick, or if you need to go get tested. And then if you come back negative, which is good, you actually don't get to take the time off, you get docked for your pay. So, and we're anticipating even more calls for support now that the eviction orders that were put on hold for a stretch of time are coming back into effect. Unemployment benefits are running out for so many people. Layoffs continue to happen. There's no guarantee of a second stimulus coming for people who desperately need that help. So we are trying to work and move in service of all of these folks. We view our work as part of the broader labor movement. We're not in competition with labor unions. We're actually part of the same fights. We just address them from different angles. And we don't view our work and organized labor's work as either or. It's 100% yes and. We need to hit this from every angle all the time. And we support and amplify the voices of so many marginalized people who are risking their livelihoods by pushing for change. They lead and we amplify in any way we can. And we talk to working people who are trying to fight racism and sexism and ableism, all the isms, who are struggling with their mental health, people who are worried about losing their jobs if they fight back. And we really try to help let the voices of working people lead. We try to change the dynamics around whose voices are championed, who's allowed to challenge authority, what's allowed to be challenged in the workplace. And as an extension of that, we're really deeply invested in building worker power. So I will stop there so we can get into these juicy questions you have for us.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to just build on something that you said but put it to the whole group. All of you sort of said it in some way, but this idea of elevating certain voices that haven't been elevated before. Nikki, both you and Tanya spoke to this about how life before the pandemic was a particular way, but it's not only until the pandemic happened that people apparently are starting to pay attention. And so the question is really, how have you in your organizations thought about harnessing this energy, this activism? How are you trying to channel it to see the change that you try to see, especially as it relates to Black workers or workers of color or whoever, but particularly, right, as I think the theme here is workers of color really just haven't been elevated historically.
So I think I want to just kind of speak to that. And there are a couple of things that come to my mind, especially when we talk about essential workers. I'm sure my co-panelists will agree with me, right, and find it very ironic that the same people that we've been fighting tooth and nail for to get paid $15 an hour, suddenly we're able to receive heroes pay. The exact same employees who've been fighting for years for health and safety equipment were able to get protective gear. And even this term, essential workers, what makes a worker essential? I would submit to you that these workers have always been essential because people have realized how their lives are impacted when they don't have the services, the labor that these workers provide. They've always been essential. However, prior to this moment of a pandemic, we also saw these workers as disposable. And I would submit to you that they were seen as disposable because they were Black and brown workers primarily, and women workers. And their labor was seen as less than. And there's a lesson for us, though, in when we think about what's occurred from this pandemic. My mother used to have two sayings, and she would say, closed mouths don't get fed, frozen. And the way that I capture those two sentiments from my mom in this moment is around what does it mean to have power, right? And power means that you speak up, that you are loud, that you are bold, that you make demands. Those are practices that are usually shunned within our community. And then the second one about controlling your power and not waiting to be chosen. I think that's what we're seeing in our country. We don't see workers receiving heroes pay or being called essentials because of the goodwill of employers. We see it because when the pandemic hit, people weren't going to work. And that withholding of their labor and the doing of that was a powerful moment. And it was in the fear of losing these services, losing these products, losing these comforts that we have come to take for granted, is what has led to us even having the title of an essential worker. And so one of the things I think that doesn't get lifted up, but should when we are thinking about and talking about this moment, is that we hear a lot of discussion around the protests, and maybe somebody calls them riots or anything like that, and why are people destroying their neighborhood or other communities? But we don't have a lot of conversation around the power of protest and civil disobedience. We know, however, that many politicians, especially Black politicians, who already supported an action on racial issues. We know that for those politicians, that protest emboldened them to introduce and pass bills related to race. We also know that House Republicans are 4% more likely to vote in favor of bills to amend race-related complaints, and Democrats, there is a jump of 8%. And so, lastly, I'll say the other thing that we know is that politicians are most influenced by protests that take place within their own congressional districts. And so when I think about power and building power, it comes with really creating this movement, this energy, this acceptance, this even that if people are going to have power, that they need to go and they need to demonstrate, and change has occurred in our country. And so even if we look back on history and what that's shown us, right? After Bloody Sunday, the marches from Selma to Montgomery in 1965, President Johnson issued an executive order that directed the Attorney General to assist federal agencies enforcing Title V of the Civil Rights Act. After the Black college marches in 1980s, President Jimmy Carter issued an executive order that strengthened and expanded the capacity of historically Black colleges. And then following the anti-apartheid protests of 1985, President Ronald Reagan issued an executive order restricting various loans, exports, and trade with South Africa's apartheid government. Those moments in history show us the power of protest, and that's what we do as movements, as labor movements, as worker movements. That's what we need to continually train and encourage people to do more of, and to not shun that effort of collective mobility. I would say even in our times today, especially when we talk about COVID and Black Lives Matter and the protests that we're seeing about the excessive policing in our communities, we see in your city, LA, Mayor Garcetti calling for a $150 million cut in budgets to the LAPD. In New York, we see Mayor de Blasio saying that funding will be shifted from the New York Police Department to youth and social services. In Denver, police have banned the usage of chokeholds, etc. Even in Louisville, where Breonna Taylor was killed, after the police executed that no-knock warrant in her apartment, that Metro Council has moved to limit the use of and potentially ban those types of warrants. And then lastly, because I live in the South, I can't help but also lift up the Confederate monuments that are following all throughout the South, and we never would have seen that happen. And so when we talk about power, I think it really, we can't exclude the ability to make advances and gains that we may not have witnessed before, just when people recognize their power of coming together and using their voices, even when the opposition and media says to us, be quiet, you shouldn't do that, that's not polite, it's not professional, that's not the best way to go about it. The reality is that's how a lot of change has taken place in our country. And I think that that's the way that we will continue to see what we're seeing in this moment, which is wins and gains that we thought were never possible, happening a lot faster than we've ever seen before.
So thank you, Tanya. I want to just have you, Nikki and Aisha, build on this, particularly because both of your organizations don't just focus on Black workers, right? So how important are these issues that Tanya has talked about that are important, obviously, for Black workers who her organization supports? How important are these issues as you consider the work that your organizations are doing when, of course, you're not just focusing on Black workers?
I mean, it's critical. I mean, as Tanya was talking about it, I was like, yes, all of that. But where my mind really went in, to the question of, the opportunity of this moment really just for me goes back to the need for more public investment. And I feel like the opportunity in this moment is to get people more focused, so that we can use our collective action, for that purpose. Because I just think that while, it's something that's like logical and makes a lot of sense, I would say pre-pandemic, it's been a huge challenge to get people mobilized around this idea of, public investment. I mean, it still is a challenge. Like, inside of SEIU, getting folks to organize a rally or, virtually, like to do, some kind of action around, federal, getting more federal dollars into state and local governments is less sexy than, say, like, just like take it to the streets for, some other issue. But the reality is that most of what we are talking about that needs to change, like whether it be, divestment in police and greater investment in education or greater investment in, other critical services that we need, all of that at the end of the day is connected to, our value around how much money we is invested in these critical services. And we know that, the last 30 to 40 years has really been an assault, right, on the public sector and on investment in public services, so that, corporations are not expected to pay their fair share. And even those electeds and groups that we consider to be our friends and our allies, there's a huge reluctance to call that out, to call those corporations to the carpet and demand that they pay more. And even when you think about, well, let me just back up a little bit. Part of what's happening with the pandemic is that state and local government budgets have been decimated, right? If you go back to 2000, the Great Recession of 2008, they were wiped out. And then, we spent, the last, 12 years or so building everything back up. And now they're decimated again. I mean, billions of dollars in state and local governments where they have huge shortfalls. And so how are state and local government, how are electeds thinking about making up those shortfalls? On the backs of workers. The first thing that they think about when they think about how do they, make up those shortfalls is that they want to lay off workers, they want to cut services, they want to, so it's all like, it's all about, making workers pay instead of making corporations pay. And I just think that that's a huge problem that, again, is, it's not hard to connect the dots for people, but it's certainly a huge challenge in terms of mobilizing, folks to sort of understand, why it's so important that we demand that there be greater investment and that we demand that it not be done on the backs of workers. Because if you go back to the Great Recession and you look at the states and governments that actually increase public spending, they had stronger economic growth than those that cut services. And so that's part of what I feel like is the message, is that, when we think about, trying to make things better for not just, workers in general, but especially for Black folks, and we think about, trying to confront systemic racism, part of the way that we are going to do that is through the way that our public dollars are spent. And we have to we have to make sure that as we are rising up, that we're educating people about that, going back to Tanya's point about collective action and the power of collective action, the only way that we are going to really be to influence those things is through collective action. But we're going to have to educate people to understand, like, those are it's the way our dollars are invested that is really going to lead to the real policy changes that we need.
Aisha, I want you to jump in.
So I think that, like, this panel knows this, and hopefully the people who are watching us know this too, but worker struggle is racial struggle. There is no collective struggle in this labor movement without adopting a racial justice lens through which the movement can see progress, period. Tanya and Nneki mentioned that, like, policies we have in place now, people we have in power and positions now didn't get there because someone decided to open the door gently and let them usher them in. It's systemic change won't happen. It can't happen without widespread, routine, collective action, whether it's in the streets around people getting gunned down or people not having access to the right testing and prevention for COVID, or if it's in workplaces where people are trying to organize for better working conditions or fair wages and benefits. Organizations and policymakers should be looking at ways to make it easier and less risky. They should be, but they aren't, and have to be pushed to make it easier and less risky for working people to engage in workplace actions, whether it's, protecting people from employer surveillance or things like that make it dangerous for them to speak out to try to change the conditions at work. They want to keep their jobs. People want to keep their jobs. They want to be paid fairly. They want to be treated with respect and fairness. You can't talk about workers and labor without talking about race and addressing racism. And it shouldn't only be Black workers who are talking about race and racism as individuals or within their organizations as well. So, one of the things that we're doing at Coworker, and that I'm trying to lead us in the right direction and down the right path around, is not being neutral about issues and, looking inward and not just walking the talk. We actually have to be intentional in order to do the work to change communities, to change policy, to change workplaces. You have to make sure your own workplace also reflects the values that you're fighting for in the world. Are you being intentional about building teams and establishing a team culture or an organizational culture that's rooted in autonomy and equity and liberatory practice and a culture of care? Are you actively trying to work to dismantle all the toxic habits and approaches and work styles and management practices? Like, we all have left places or started things or taken new jobs because we didn't like how we were treated at other places. And if you just keep moving from one workplace to another and none of those things change, there has to be a moment where you just flip the table upside down and try to build something new. You can't just talk about diversity and inclusion. You actually have to build a team and organizational culture that's based on equity and opportunity. When you hire Black and brown folks, when you hire queer folks of color, are you actually letting them lead? Are you interrogating what it means to be productive? Like, we talk about essential work and productivity. What does it mean if people want to take the time off or are fighting for the paid time off they were promised as a condition of their employment, but you treat them like they're stealing time and they don't have a right to have access to that? Or you want to paint them as lazy? Are you making space inside your organization with your staff and your leadership to proactively envision the world that we all want to live in? I know we have to move in reactionary spaces all the time, but what does it look like if your organization actually makes space to think about the world you want, and then you are working to build that together? And what does it mean to radically transform your organization from the inside out? And if you're able to do that, if lots of people are able to do that, then what does the movement look like? How does the movement shift? How does that make space for more people like us on this panel to be in positions to lead and to influence what policy should look like and to influence how organizations move in the world? So those are some of the things that we're thinking about. And when I hear you, Fila, and Tanya and Nneki talking about these things, like, I am in a position, probably because we're locked in the house. Those of us who work remotely, we're locked inside. I have a lot of time to think about what it means to actually try to change I mean, I know a lot of people use the term future of work, but like, what does it mean to actually change what work looks like and how that impacts all of us as Black people?
So I'm just gonna keep moving and even pull in the questions from the audience because they do fall in line. But as you all are talking, I'm thinking about allyship, who you're building coalitions with. We have folks who are interested in how you're interfacing with philanthropy, workforce development, job centers. How do we build in this sort of multi-stakeholder, collaborative, coalitional environment that I think, for me, when I look at the complexity of issues, I don't think we get to systemic change without doing that. So what has that looked like in your various organizations? And then, yeah, so.
Well, I will say, just because this question is sort of fresh on my mind, it's I'm going to struggle with how to articulate it, but there's certain issues that we can lead on. There are certain issues that we can follow on, and I think that through the years we've had to learn the hard way at SEIU that we are not going to lead on everything. That everything is not ours to lead, and so I think that just declaring that and realizing that, and was a huge step. And I think that so one example of how we are doing better at just understanding that piece is the work that we are doing with the Movement for Black Lives. That there's a commitment that has been made at every level of the organization around our commitment to be an anti-racist organization, but also to really show up, right, in the Movement for Black Lives. But it is in a supportive role, right? It is in a way that is about how can we bring resources to the table? How can we be good partners? But certainly not take the attitude that that our role needs to be one where SEIU is trying to be out front, right? And that's not to say because it's not our fight, because obviously it is our fight too. When you think about the 2 million folks that we represent, and the majority of them being people of color, obviously it is our fight. But the Black Lives Matter and other organizations are certainly better positioned to lead on that fight. So we are trying to show up how in the best way that we can, and like I said, in for us in this particular example, it is through bringing resources to the table. So I'll stop there, but I do think that is the partnership and working together is going to be the only way that we get there. But I think we all just need to sort of understand what our role is in those partnerships.
I mean, what would you say? So I'm getting a lot of questions about like unemployment, right? Lack of jobs. How do we address that? That's a big question, but right, like the work of your organizations are doing, this is probably one of the foremost major issues. I know for Tanya, the National Black Worker-Center was built around this idea of the Black jobs crisis, right? So can you speak to that and what role, if not that your organization is directly focused on, who should be focusing on that?
I mean, so I think I spoke a lot. I think as a board member of the National Black Worker Center Project, because I, am a partnering with Tanya through that way. Unemployment is certainly a big part of, the work that we are focused on. So I'm actually going to punt that one to Tanya to talk a little bit about our work there at the National Black Worker Center.
Sure, thank you. So I definitely feel that being focused on the unemployed is something that any organization that calls themselves a worker justice organization, an organizing movement organization should be focused on. When I talked earlier about the ones, the twos, and the threes, certainly the unemployed fall into that category of twos. And so when we talk about organizing workers, that includes people that are employed, unemployed, and underemployed. And so I will say we don't have a strategy on what that looks like, but I know that if unemployed workers are not part of the conversation and they're not at the table, then we can't provide any meaningful solution without having their voices present. I think that when we talk about building power, it shouldn't just be if it's only power for people who have jobs, even if the jobs are low wage jobs, then we will lose. We will fail. It's the same construct of thinking about let's build an economy for the wealthy, right? If we only have an economy for the wealthy, that will topple over because the masses will not allow that to stand. And so when we are building our campaigns and we are building our movements, let's be thoughtful about let's be thoughtful and mindful to include unemployed workers in that conversation and in that strategy. What are the wins and gains that they need for us, our campaigns to embody? When I think about the union movement and I think about organizing workers, I would love to see an organizing campaign that is not solely focused on a particular workplace or employer. I would love to see a mass movement, especially when you talk about working in coalition with one another. Can we work in coalition and have an organizing campaign that's on the ground and its sole purpose is to build power for all workers? And that means, dealing with employers that get contracts at the state and the federal level, having language that says in order to get these contracts, you have to employ not just a certain amount of, EEO standards with people of color, but people who don't have jobs. For employers that are currently doing well, what can we not advocate for and have campaigns that say you have to train unemployed workers, you have to bring those folks into your workplace? As we are looking to the presidential elections and what hopefully the next president will do in his first 100 days of office, can we not mobilize to put pressure and say any work that you do, but because we see so much messaging around the working class community, right? Can we not have a joint message that says also including the unemployed, do not speak in class and you don't have our support, basically.
Sorry, you're cutting out a bit. I know there's a storm where you are, Tanya.
Yeah.
I think you froze a little. You were cutting out a bit on the end there. But I think, I don't know if you want to repeat the last 2 seconds of what you just said, or yeah. I know there's a storm there, so and we're like running low on time. I think I just want to sort of ask each of you quickly, if you could identify a policy action that you'd like to see. I don't know if it's related to the upcoming elections or what have you. What would it be? What would you say?
I'm going to try this again, and hopefully my connection will allow me to, you guys to hear me, my screen won't freeze up. The Pew Research Center last month just released its, and wave or something if I freeze, people, so that I know that I've frozen. But the Pew Research Center last month released its polling on the top economy issues for voters in this 2020 election. And no surprise to anyone, economy, healthcare, Supreme Court appointments, and the coronavirus outbreaks were at the top of that list. But what was surprising to me in this moment of protest and uprising and talk about walls and immigrants and whatnot is how low on that survey these policies for race and ethnic inequality, immigration, and economic inequality fail on the surveys that they took. And I'm not sure who were the people that they surveyed, because I never get to be one of those people that get surveyed. But I will say that, in conjunction to the point that I was making earlier, if we are not focused on economic inequality, if we're not focused on racial justice, if we don't answer those problems, there will be no solution. There will be no economy solutions. There will be no healthcare solutions. We have to disavow ourselves of this notion of that there are some people that are just less than, and those people just get left behind. When we have that practice, we create an environment for civil unrest and for civil disobedience that just continues, and it does not get us to where we need to be in terms of being part of a community and a country where we all belong and we all can be proud of. And so when I think about policies that need to happen, tops on my priorities are ending the systemic racism and discrimination policies, practices, and laws that have hindered the growth of our country for centuries.
Okay, who wants to, Aisha, Naniki? Yes.
So I'll piggyback on what Tanya said and just say that I agree with that. I will also say that many of us are living in the midst of an election cycle and a political moment that is unlike anything we have experienced before. We have read about these things, but not all of us have actually lived through this kind of thing in real time. And that when it comes to conversations about policy issues that should be on the table, I think we really need to be focused on stopping the further erosion of the policies that are still in place and are under threat of being dismantled. And that if we're lucky, it will only take a few decades to repair the harms that have happened in the last 4 years. But there isn't a Band-Aid or a stopgap or one policy recommendations that's going to fix all of this if we don't actually talk about race, racism, white supremacy, and how it influences every piece of work, labor, and culture.
Okay. Naniki?
Yeah, so I think that there's so much, but we've been working on a policy that is focused on care jobs, the creation of care jobs. So there would be, the education workforce, in addition to, home health care. But the idea would be that we would not only so the investment would be around relief and recovery as it related to the pandemic. But also, I would say the biggest and most important piece would be around workforce standards, so that the creation of these jobs would mean that they're not poverty jobs, that they are, good paying, benefited jobs, that, where workers can sustain a family, and be rewarded, for the work that they do through, some kind of a career ladder that, pushes them toward, opportunities, to grow through some type of a career ladder or something that, like that. So, policy is obviously not my not my area of expertise, but I would say, we certainly, want to make sure, again, that, that folks can go back to the idea of doing one job, not 3 or 4, to piece together one life. So ultimately, that's what I would say.
Thank you. And so I just want to, we're a little over time, but I want to wrap this up and even share, I think, my thought on this, which I think it connects maybe all of this, hopefully. I would say, I started out talking about the pandemic as a crisis, racism as a crisis. I didn't have an opportunity to list down, I think, the other crises we're dealing with, from climate crisis to student debt crisis to a crisis in our public health and education system. I mean, the list goes on. I think that's pretty clear. But I just want to reinforce to everyone, and I think this connects to what I would say is the thing we can do, is at the center of these crises lie workers. And we are actually all the workers. And I think that what often is missing, we have in our society been educated to think that being a worker is not success. I remember someone telling me once, through my work in Next 100, why did they give you the worker label? As if that was something that I wouldn't want. And I think if we actually are really honest, we would see that we actually all are workers, that the growing financial economic crisis, the mental health crisis, the emotional, all of these crises that we're experiencing, I'm not sure how you cannot see yourself reflected in it. I think even Jeff Bezos would say there are crises. I mean, I'll just leave it at that. But so I say that because for me, systemic change is really thinking about the interconnectedness of all of these things, and how we organize in coalition across boundaries. I think someone put a comment in, I want to appreciate it. The Alliance is looking at trying to go after companies like Amazon and Walmart and all of these huge companies that really transect across all of these boundaries, are just examples to me of why we have to be able to work in broad-based coalition and elevate the workers who we haven't been elevating, like Black workers, like workers of color. So I just want to say that's sort of my piece of, I think, what is missing from this is that we collectively have to see ourselves as workers as a first step to why it's important for us to address these issues. So we are over time, unfortunately have to stop there. I feel like we were just getting heated up. But thank you so much. Again, I want to just thank all our panelists here. Thank you so much to the audience, the attendees. Thank you to Next 100 and the Century Foundation. And I hope this conversation doesn't end here. So thank you so much to everyone.